Hello, welcome or welcome back. My name is Ari and today we're going to see how fast I can talk because I have to wrap up 18 books, and if I just took 2 minutes per book it would take like 38 minutes and no one wants to watch a 38-minute video. Not to mention the stats, which let's get into first. As I just said, I read 18 books this month. That was 6,456 pages, which was roughly 215 pages per day or 359 pages per book. Out of the genres I've read 9 fantasy, 2 thrillers, 2 nonfiction, 2 poetry, 1 classic, 1 general fiction, and 1 sci-fi. Out of the authors, 13 of them were female and 5 of them were male. The demographic of the books was 15 of them were for an adult audience, 2 for a young adult audience, and 1 middle grade. The source, 10 of them were backlist books that I already owned. 4 of them were ARCs, 2 from the library, 1 from a book box, and 1 of them was brand new. For the format, 11 of them were physical books, 4 ebooks, and 3 audiobooks. Look at me go with audiobooks this month. 12 of them were by authors that I had read from before, and 6 of them were new to me authors. Star ratings, I had 2 5 stars. I think both of them were rereads. Oops. 5 4 stars, 10 3 stars, no 2 stars, and 1 1-star book. I also DNF'd 1 book. Hopefully we went through those stats fast enough, and now let's get into the books that I've read. So I'm going to do this a little bit differently than I normally do. This month, every single book that I read somehow fit into a class or a quest for the Magical Readathon. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to tell you what prompt it was used for the Magical Readathon, and then give you an elevator pitch as fast as I possibly can. Start with my first class was Elemental Studies, under 100 pages. For this I read The Hill We Climb by Amanda Gorman. This was the inaugural poem. This was a little too bright and shiny for me. It was just coming off the Trump administration and everybody thought that everything was going to get so much better without Trump in power, and that didn't happen. So this was like, everything's gonna be great, and in hindsight it's like, yeah, it's not really though, is it? Okay. The next book I read was for the Animal Studies prompt, and this was a quick read. For that I read Warrior of the Altai by Robert Jordan. This was Robert Jordan's first written book, but it was published after his death. It's kind of prehistoric fantasy. It's fine. If you like Robert Jordan, I wouldn't tell you not to read it, but it's not something like you have to read. Next up for Astronomy, the book on the top of your TBR. Mine was The Book of Cold Cases by Simone St. James. This is a thriller with ghosty aspects. I very much enjoyed it. Dual timeline, and it's kind of like a cold case podcaster trying to solve a case. So if you're not interested in that, you probably won't like this book, but I like the ghost. Next class was Alchemy, and that was a book featuring a romance. I read The Awakening by Kate Chopin. This is a classic about a woman who marries into a Creole family and isn't quite sure what to do about not having a jealous husband and able to spend all of her time with other men with 0 jealousy, and she doesn't handle it properly for a Creole woman and shit goes down. This was fine. I was bored reading it. It was a 3-star. Next class was Inscription, and I needed to read an intimidating read. For that I read Fevered Star by Rebecca Roadhorse. This is the sequel to Black Sun. It was definitely a sequel. I hate one of the characters, but I like the story. That's pretty much all. More about that one is in my ARC video. The next class I had was Artificiary, and for that I need a book with an Earth setting. For that I read a historical fiction called The Little Stranger by Sarah Waters. This is a really interesting literary novel where the main character is a doctor who's obsessed with this family's house post-World War II, and the house is falling down because the family is destitute, and a bunch of things are happening, and you don't know if it's like PTSD or if it's actually ghosts and hauntings and stuff, and you don't really ever figure out an answer because the narrator is an outside character. But I really, really like this. This is a 5-star reread from me, and I highly recommend it if you like literary historical fiction. For spells and incantations, I needed a short story slash poetry, either a short story or poem, or a short story collection, poetry collection. I read a poetry collection called Under Her Skin edited by Lindsay Ryan. This is a feminist kind of horror collection, a lot of body horror. It was okay, it's not my favorite kind of poetry. More about this in my ARC video. Next class was Restoration, and for that I needed to read a book featuring healers. I picked Dragons of Autumn Twilight, which is the very first Dragonlance novel. I knew this had a cleric in it, and I was hoping that the cleric cast a healing spell at some point, which would be a book featuring a healer. Turns out the cleric is the cleric of the goddess of healing. How fucking perfect is that? I actually really, really enjoyed this, except for one very icky part where a female character is being described as the perfect, like, female. All of the men are lusting after her, but all of the words that are used to describe her perfect mating ability, I guess, is like words like childlike and innocent. So they're describing her as a child, but saying they want to fuck her, which is really fucking creepy. Other than that, this was a fantastic book, full of nostalgia and shit like that. The next class I had was Demonology, and that was a book with the word shadow in the title. For that I read The Beckoning Shadow by Catherine Blair. This is pretty much X-Men. Like, no shit. This is X-Men. So if you really like the X-Men but want it for a young adult teenage audience, then go ahead and read this. If you don't like X-Men or think that premise sounds stupid as much as I thought it sounded stupid, this book is still written fine. It's like a 3-star. The next class is Lore, and you need a mythology-inspired book. For that, I read A River Enchanted by Rebecca Ross. This is a very interesting combination of books. So if you like the myth retellings that are popular, like right now, like Ariadne and Circe and stuff like that, you like that idea but want to combine it with like the fairies from like Sarah J Maas and stuff like that, I think you would like this. It's kind of like very myth retelly with fairies, but it's not fairy porn, and it's not like as feminist as like Ariadne or something like that, though a lot of the really, really powerful characters in this book are female, and there are very interesting instances of typical role reversals where the homemaker is the male character and the fighter is the female character. So very much enjoyed this, highly recommend. The next class was Psionics and Divination, and I needed to read a book set in the future. For that, I read The Infinite Sea by Rick Yancey. This is the second book in the Fifth Wave series, and this is a YA dystopian. This is so generic YA dystopian, like just entirely generic Hunger Games, Divergent, that kind of story. That is what this is. I love those kind of stories, so I very much enjoyed this, but I totally understand that this is not for everybody. And if you don't like that kind of story, you're not gonna like this, because this is peak generic YA dystopian. Next class is Shape-Shifting, and for this you needed a book with claws on the cover. For that, I read Hunger of the Gods by John Gwynne. This was an ARC, so you could see more about it in my ARC video, but second in this series, I don't know the name of the series, but we're following 5 different characters. 2 of them are bad guys, and John Gwynne writes bad guys really well, and there's a bunch of shit going down with, like, gods. It's hard to describe this book because it's the second in the series of an epic fantasy, and a lot of what I would say about this book is going to spoil the first book, so sorry. those are all of the classes that I took. There was 2 of them that I didn't finish the book for. But next, let's go into the quest. And my first quest is a 5-star prediction book. For that, I read Spinning Silver by Naomi Novik. Did I give this 5 stars? No. This is basically a Rumpelstiltskin retelling, set in winter. You follow a bunch of different women through the really awful shit that happens to women in the past, where they have no control over, like, being married to somebody that they don't want to be married to, and yet they come out stronger. There's fairies in here, kind of romances, but it's not really romance heavy. It's pretty good. I liked it, but it wasn't 5 stars. The next quest was a new to you author, and for this I read The Last Nomad by Sugary Saeed Saul, I think is her name. The cover's here if I said some of that incorrectly, but this is a memoir about a woman who grew up in Somalia in like the 1990s. She lived through the Somali War before fleeing to Canada as a refugee. This book was so good. Sugary is like the best kind of storyteller, and I do recommend this as an audiobook. Just one really major content warning for this one is in Somalia they do practice female circumcision, and there is a very graphic description of Sugary's experience with being circumcised. So it's very graphic. Not everybody can handle that, and that's fine. It's so graphic the audiobook narrator even comes out of character and says, like, this is the narrator, I'm about to describe in graphic detail female circumcision, and if you can't listen to that, then please skip ahead. So graphic, but just her experiences and her outlook on life was one of like the most wonderful things that I read. This is my other 5-star for the month, and it wasn't a reread, so there you go. 5 stars, fantastic book, highly recommend. The next quest was a book off of someone else's TBR, and for this I read In a Garden Burning Gold by Rory Power. This was also an ARC, so if you are interested in more about this, you can watch my ARC video. This is Rory Power's adult debut, and she normally writes young adult novels. This book reads as a young adult novel, honestly. Like, you could tell that she's a young adult author in this. I don't think she did a great job transitioning into adult work. The premise of this book is the most fabulous premise ever. The execution is atrociously done. Nothing made sense. The actions of the characters were like, you've been doing this for hundreds of years and you're really that incapable and that stupid? What the fuck is going on? But yeah, I did not like this. I don't think it was well executed. I don't honestly recommend it to anybody, especially because the premise sounds so good. The synopsis sounds so good. And then when you read it, it's such a disappointment that I can't even tell you that if the synopsis sounds good to read it. I'm just going to tell you that this was really bad and it's not worth your time. The next book is going to be a little confusing with the quest. The quest is a book with the letter D in the title, and for that I read the Psychopath Test, and you're like, Ari, the Psychopath Test does not have a D in the title. The whole title is The Psychopath Test, A Journey Through the Madness Industry, and madness and industry both have D's in it, so I got it. This is by Jon Ronson. This was my 1 star of the month because Jon Ronson is trash, and there is a section in here that labels being trans as a mental illness. Also, Jon Ronson is very misleading about the information that he's giving you. I have a lot of complaints about this book, but if you want to see all of my complaints, this was in my Read Your Haul and I ranted about this for a while if you want to see all the complaints, but basically everything about in here is misleading and it's very anti-trans, which I fucking hate, so fuck John Ronson. I'm not reading a book by him ever again. Next quest is a library book, and for this I read Daughter of the Deep by Rick Riordan. This one is basically a retelling of 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea in the way that Percy Jackson is a retelling of like Greek mythology. So it's modern times and set with like the descendants of the characters from 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea. It is fine. It is definitely a middle grade, but Rick Riordan's a fantastic writer. So if you liked stories like Percy Jackson, I'm not gonna point you away from this one. It's just not my particular cup of tea, but I do think that it was very, very well done for either somebody in that age range or somebody who likes reading in that age range, if that makes sense. So 3 stars for me, but I'm not recommending this one to anybody. The last book was for the quest Multiple POV, and that was Goodnight Beautiful. I don't remember the author, but it'll be over here. This was a thriller that I listened to as an audiobook, and the premise is basically this therapist moves back to his hometown to be near to his mother, who is in a nursing home, and he and his wife move back, and and the setup is like the office is downstairs and the living space is upstairs, and there's like an old vent where everything that goes on in his office can be heard upstairs in like one of the rooms. This was okay. It's not really my kind of thriller, but I will say do not under any circumstances read this as an audiobook. This has like 3 major twists in 3 sections, and the big twist at the end of the first and second section are either basically given away by one of the audiobook narrators or like strongly hinted at. Like, you're gonna hear the audiobook narrators and know there is something up. So just avoid the audiobook if you want to read this, and go with the physical, reading it physically. Just trust me on that. The only way I can tell you without like giving away these huge plot twists is just to say avoid the audiobook. That is all of the books that I read. The one book that I did DNF was His and Hers. I'm gonna say this by Alice Feeney, but I could be completely off. This was another audiobook and another thriller. This one I hated because it was like every single chapter had a cliffhanger, even if it wasn't necessary to have a cliffhanger, and it's like swapped perspective between his and hers, and it would be like she's talking and then cliffhanger, and then it goes into his perspective and then cliffhanger, and it was just like everything's a secret. Like, we didn't care. And then the implication is one of the 2 of them is the killer, but I don't know, I didn't finish the book, but that's the implication. And so when they have the killer's narration chapters come in, they do this really bad audio distortion, so you can't tell if the person talking is male or female, if it's one of the 2 narrators that we already have. But let me tell you that like listening to that just hurt my ears. It was so badly distorted, and I hated it. I hated it so much. So I don't recommend the audiobook of that either. I don't recommend the book at all, but I'm not a big thriller person, so if you like thrillers, maybe that's a good one. I don't know. Anyway, that is all. How was my timing on that? Good, bad, faster, slower? I'm not used to talking fast, but here we go. If you made it for this far in the video and you want to leave me a comment down below, tell me what your favorite or least favorite book this month was. And if you don't have a favorite or least favorite book and you want to leave me a emoji, leave me either the knife emoji or that like scream terror emoji, because we kind of ended on some thrillers there. So I will see you down in the comments, and I will also see you on Saturday for the book haul, which is it's a pretty big haul. I went a little crazy. Anyway, thank you for being here.